Hi everyone, this is Tate Mercer. I'm working on Chapter 3, and my focus is profiling. Since I'm going to be talking about profiling today, I'll be talking about what it is, how it works in forensic psychology, and why the same basic logic shows up in modern behavioral research. I'm starting with profiling the way we learn it in forensic psychology: crime scene profiling, geographic profiling, suspect-based profiling, psychological profiling, and psychological autopsies, because those methods make the logic really visible. We look at patterns, we interpret behavior, and try to infer something about an unknown person or situation. Then I'm going to connect that to a peer-reviewed empirical study by Trusov et al. 2016, which is about profiling online users from browsing behavior. It sounds like a totally different world, but the inferential issues like bias, validity, and overconfidence are surprisingly similar and bring up the same issues. My center argument is that profiling is a powerful investigative tool, but it's not unbiased and it's not automatically scientific just because it uses data. Profiling lives in this space where we're translating observations into meaning. In forensic psychology, those observations might be a crime scene, a pattern of locations, or the behavior of a known individual. In online profiling, it might be click streams or browsing categories. In both cases, the profiler is doing something similar, using patterns to make inferences. And those inferences can be helpful, but also can be distorted if the underlying assumptions are wrong. So to briefly go over the structure, I'm going to first define profiling using the textbook and explain the main types we've covered, with special focus on what each one assumes and where it can go wrong. Second, I'll go into the Trusov et al. Study as a deep example of profiling in practice, what their goal was, what variables they used, and what their method was actually doing. Then I'll evaluate the study using strengths and weaknesses, internal and external validity issues, and what their conclusions do and don't justify. Finally, I'll connect everything back to the forensic psychology lens. Essentially, what does this teach us about profiling as a general practice, and what risks show up when profiling gets used in high-stakes environments? Patterns. So the key idea is profiling narrows possibilities, but it does not identify someone with certainty, and it does not replace evidence. What makes profiling complicated is that it depends on a chain of interpretation. This chain goes as follows. It starts with something happening, then we observe traces of it, then we interpret those traces as behavior, and then we interpret behavior as personality, motivation, or demographics. Every step introduces potential error. In other words, profiling is not just data, it's representation. It's a way of turning a messy reality into a narrative that can guide decisions. Another key thing is that profiling always involves assumptions about what behavior means. Profiling also risks base rate neglect, where rare behaviors are treated as more diagnostic than they actually are, leading to overconfidence in inferred characteristics. For example, if a crime scene shows a high degree of organization, someone might infer that the offender is methodical or socially competent. But that assumes organization at the scene directly reflects stable personality traits rather than situational factors. Similarly, in online profiling, if someone visits a bunch of shopping sites, you might infer that they're an online shopper type. However, maybe they're shopping once for a gift, or researching, or they're just bored, or price comparing because they're careful with money. The pattern is real, but the meaning can shift depending on context. So from the beginning, I want to treat profiling as something that can be useful but has built-in vulnerabilities, such as overgeneralization, confirmation bias, and misattribution of intent. And those vulnerabilities are exactly what forensic psychology warns about, especially when profiling starts to shaping who gets investigated, how examines features of the crime scene to infer characteristics or motivations of an offender. The goal is to describe significant behavioral, cognitive, emotional, lifestyle, and demographic features of an unknown person believed responsible for a series of crimes. That definition sounds very confident, but the important phrase to me is that it's an investigative tool. It's used to guide law enforcement, psychologists, and consultants basically to help prioritize leads. The key issue is what it assumes. It assumes the crime scene reflects something stable about the offender. For example, a scene might be interpreted as organized or disorganized, interpersonal or impersonal, impulsive or planned. Those labels can then get translated into psychological characteristics. But the problem is that the same behavior can mean different things depending on the situation. A person could be disorganized because they are chaotic, something interrupted them, they're inexperienced, or because they were simply rushed. So as mentioned on previous slides, profiling depends heavily on interpretation and context. This is where bias can creep in. Once a profiler builds a narrative, investigators can start looking for evidence that supports the profile rather than testing alternative explanations, ergo, confirmation bias. Another risk is that profiling can be treated like it's more scientific than it actually is. If the profile has credentials, or if the profile uses confident language, people might treat it as it's a validated diagnostic test. But in reality, it's still an inference. So in forensic psychology terms, I see crime scene profiling as useful when it's humble, when it's presented as a set of hypotheses rather than conclusions. It becomes harmful when it's treated as certainty, or when it starts narrowing an investigation in a way that excludes other viable suspects. Geographical profiling is different from crime scene profiling because it's primarily about space rather than personality or motives. It analyzes locations associated with the spatial movements of a serial offender and focuses on hotspots of a crime. The assumption is that where crimes occur is not random. Offenders often operate in spaces they know, and there's usually some comfort zone or routine activity pattern influencing where they go. That can be powerful because it's closer to a measurable pattern. If crimes cluster in a particular area, that can help narrow where investigators focus resources. However, the textbook also notes limits. It's not helpful if offenders move out of the area and it doesn't consider psychological characteristics other than the comfort zone idea. So its explanatory power is limited. It can tell you where to look, but not necessarily who to look out for or why. This method is a good example of how profiling's usefulness depends on the stability of the underlying assumption. If the offender is stable and local, geographic profiling helps. But if the offender is mobile, intentionally misdirecting, or committing crimes in multiple jurisdictions, the model then breaks down. This is a theme I'll come back to with the Trezov article. When behavior is fragmented across contexts, your profile becomes less accurate. Suspect-based profiling is one of the most important categories in the textbook for thinking ethically. It involves collecting behavioral, personality, cognitive, and demographic data on previous offenders to identify additional offenders. So it's essentially pattern matching across known cases. And this can be useful because it's based on real offenders and actual data, so it's more reliable. However, the textbook explicitly warns that it can lend itself to illegal or biased profiling, especially based on race, religion, or ethnicity. This is where profiling becomes socially dangerous. If the profile drifts from behavior to identity markers, you end up treating demographic traits as if they are casual explanations for criminal behavior. That's not only ethically wrong, but it's also poor science because it confuses correlation, context, and causation. The textbook also says that end product should describe people from various offender groups, which is important because it implies diversity within offender categories. In other words, suspect-based profiling should avoid acting like offender type equals one demographic identity. The best version of suspect-based profiling would focus on behavioral patterns, situational factors, and contextual risk variables, rather than protected characteristics. This also connects to modern profiling. In digital contexts, profiling can become discriminatory even when it doesn't explicitly include race because proxies exist. Location, browsing patterns, purchase behavior, and social networks can function as proxies for demographic identity. So the risk of biased outcomes isn't limited to law enforcement. It's structural. Whenever you profile people using patterns that correlate with inequality, you risk reproducing that inequality through your neutral tool. Profiling provides a detailed description of the psychological characteristics of one known individual and is used in threat or risk assessment. What's important is that it isn't necessarily criminal profiling. It can apply to someone who hasn't committed a crime but is being assessed for potential risk. That's a huge jump because now profiling is shaping how institutions treat someone based on predicted future behavior. The textbook points out that psychological profiling can be destructive, speculative, and dependent on unreliable source material. That makes sense because threat assessment often involves secondhand reports, social media, writing samples, or interviews. If the sources are biased or incomplete, the profile will be too. It also notes that measures used in threat assessment may not be valid, which raises a direct validity issue. If your measurement tools are weak, your risk conclusions are not reliable. Psychological autopsy is similar in that it tries to reconstruct a psychological picture, but after death, often to determine manner of death in equivocal cases. The textbook says there are no accepted guidelines for how to conduct it, and that in court it may not be admitted or it may be refuted. That matters because it tells us the method lacks standardization, so reliability can vary a lot between evaluators. So for both psychological profiling and psychological autopsy, the central issue is methodological. How much of a conclusion is grounded in strong evidence versus interpretation? In legal context, that matters because interpretation can be challenged. And in clinical or institutional contexts, it matters because it can affect decisions about safety, punishment, or prevention. The reason I chose Trusov et al. Is because it shows profiling in a modern context that isn't about crime, but still relies on the same structure. Observe behavior, categorize patterns, infer stable characteristics, and then use those inferences to make decisions. In forensic contexts, the behavior comes from a crime scene, locations, or known individuals. In this study, the behavior comes from online browsing and website visitation patterns. But the underlying question is similar. How do we infer meaningful profiles from behavioral traces, especially when our view is incomplete? This is going to help us evaluate profiling more critically, because if profiling struggles with bias and incomplete data in a marketing context where the stakes are arguably lower, it raises questions about how careful we need to be in forensic settings where the stakes are much higher. Trusov et al. Define a user profile as a summary of consumer interests and preferences revealed through online activity. The paper's purpose is to develop a modeling approach that uncovers individual profiles from browsing data and allows firms to make profile predictions even when information is limited. The limited information part is important because it's basically the equivalent of forensic profiling when you don't have full evidence. You're trying to infer an unknown from partial traces, which will never work. They use panel data from more than 45,000 households over 12 months, with detailed website browsing information. The data has huge coverage. Hundreds of thousands of domain names categorized into 29 categories and subcategories. They represent profiles as counts of visits to different categories. So for example, entertainment, retail, social media, and the news are basically a person's behavioral footprint across the internet. The core idea is that people take on different roles when surfing the web, such as being a shopper, a social networker, or an information seeker. And the observed browsing behavior is generated by a mixture of those roles. That's conceptually similar to how forensic profiling might interpret behaviors as evidence of underlying motivations or traits, except here it's formalized statistically. A big part of the paper's motivation is that different platforms have fragmented views of users. Search engines see some behaviors, ad networks see different behaviors, and no one sees the full person unless they have extremely comprehensive tracking. This means profiles inferred from partial data can be biased. That's extremely relevant to profiling generally. The accuracy of a profile depends on whether your observations are representative or distorted by what you can't see. The authors use a model inspired by topic models in machine learning. Normally, topic models are used in language processing. A document contains multiple topics, and topics generate words. Here, they treat a user's browsing history like a document, and the categories of sites they visit like the words. The topics become behavioral roles, so a person's overall browsing profile is modeled as a mixture of roles, and each role has a probability distribution over website categories. The reason this matters is because it avoids a simplistic idea that each person has one fixed identity. Instead, a person can be part social networker, part shopper, part information seeker. That's more realistic, and it also parallels something forensic psychology emphasizes, that behavior often reflects context, and people can shift patterns depending on needs or circumstances. They also incorporate visitation intensity, which is basically how active someone is online, and demographics like age and income. That introduces heterogeneity, which is important because it acknowledges different baseline levels of online behavior. In forensic terms, this is similar to acknowledging that base rates and context matter. Different populations have different baseline patterns, so your interpretation needs to be careful. The paper also focuses heavily on data fragmentation and bias. They show that platforms like search engines and advertising networks see different slices of behavior. Even if a company has a lot of data, it can still be biased if that data overrepresents certain categories and underrepresents others. For example, they discuss how some data sources might overcount certain categories like portals or entertainment relative to someone's true browsing distribution, leading to distorted profiles. So, methodologically, their contribution is not just we can profile users, it's we can profile users probabilistically, update profiles with limited data, and identify how incomplete data sources systemically bias profile inference. That's a very forensic relevant idea. Incomplete evidence doesn't just reduce accuracy randomly. It can produce systematic distortion. It also is important to distinguish between different sources of bias. Sampling bias affects who or what is observed. Measurement bias affects which behaviors are captured, and interpretive bias affects how those behaviors are translated into profiles. Profiling errors can emerge at any of these stages. Interpretable roles like entertainer, information seeker, shopper, social networker, family person, career person, and adult entertainer. That matters because it demonstrates interpretability. This isn't just a black box. It produces categories that humans can actually understand. They also show role composition varies across people and across time, meaning profiling has to treat identity as flexible rather than fixed. One of the most important findings is that profile inference based on incomplete data sources can be biased. The paper argues that even major online firms can produce distorted profiles if they only rely on their own first-party data. That's a methodological warning. Big data does not automatically mean good data. Now for the strengths, the study's major scale is a major strength. 45,000 plus households and longitudinal tracking. Another strength is that they explicitly acknowledge bias and test how profile reconstruction varies by data source. That's a level of methodological that actually strengthens conclusions because they're not pretending that the model is perfect. But for weaknesses, the biggest one in my opinion is the profiling issue, that behavior doesn't equal intent. Visiting certain categories doesn't always mean preference. Sometimes it's obligation, curiosity, or one-time needs. So the inferred role of a statistical summary, not a psychological diagnosis. That's important because it affects what kinds of conclusions are justified. You can say, this pattern resembles shopping behavior, but you can't say this person is a shopper type in a deep psychological sense. Internal validity concerns here include whether the model's inferred roles truly reflect latent behavioral patterns in a stable way or whether they are partly artifacts of the categorizational system and measurement approach. If website categories are constructed in a particular way, the roles could be shaped by those categories. Another internal issue is that the model assumes that the data represents meaningful behavior, but it may not capture context, like why someone visited a site. External validity concerns include generalizability. The data is a panel from 2012, and online behavior changes over time. Also, households might differ from individuals. Device usage has changed, privacy restrictions have changed, so while the modeling approach is valuable, the exact role distributions and platform differences might not generalize perfectly today. The broader point about fragmentation and bias probably does generalize, but we should be careful not to overstate specifics. Importantly, what counts as a successful profile differs by context. In forensic settings, success may mean narrowing investigative focus, whereas in digital profiling, it often means predictive accuracy or commercial utility. These different standards complicate how we evaluate profiling accuracy. Now I want to connect this back to forensic psychology. Profiling in forensic contexts has the same core validity problem, the leap from behavior to a stable characteristic. A crime scene may indicate actions, but motives and traits are interpretations. Similarly, a browsing profile indicates behavior, but intent and identity are interpretations. The danger in both contexts is overconfidence, treating a probabilistic profile as a definitive statement about a person. That's where harm happens. Investigations get narrowed incorrectly, risk assessments overpredict danger, and institutional decisions are made on shaky inference. The Trezov study is essentially a modern demonstration of profiling principles. It's not crime scene profiling, but it shows how profiling works when the scene is behavioral data. It parallels suspect-based profiling because it relies on patterns extracted from large datasets of known behavior to classify and predict other behaviors. It also raises similar ethical issues the textbook flags that we have visited prior. Profiling can drift into bias even if it isn't explicitly using race or religion because proxies exist and because data sources are not equally representative. The research also extends what we learn in the textbook by showing a formal method for dealing with incomplete information. In forensic contexts, we often deal with incomplete evidence too. The study's emphasis on fragmentation and bias helps us understand why profiling sometimes feels convincing, but can still be systematically wrong. Not because the profiler is careless, but because the data they're seeing is incomplete or distorted, as mentioned before. Ethically, I think both contexts raise major concerns. In criminal justice, profiling can affect policing, suspicion, and potentially wrongful investigation. In digital systems, profiling can affect what information people see, what opportunities they get, what ads they're targeted with, and how they're categorized, often without transparency. In both cases, profiling is tied to power. Whoever controls the model controls the narrative of what your behavior means. Profiling should be understood as an investigative aid rather than a form of evidence or proof. And it should never be treated as a substitute for direct investigation. So to finish, my discussion question is, where do you think profiling is more dangerous? Criminal investigations, where consequences are intense but affecting fewer people, or everyday digital systems, where consequences can be subtler but scaled to millions? Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed.